April webinar. Oh, Hello, welcome to the Illinois Soybean Growers April webinar featuring Davon Cook from Pinion Global. Today we're going to be talking about transitions in leadership on your farm business. Before we get started, I just want to share some logistical topics. First off, there is a Q&A available. Please, we encourage you to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A as the webinar progresses, and then Devon will address them at the end of her presentation. There will also be an option for the recording to be shared after the presentation. And for those of you looking for CEU credits for certified crop advisors, that QR code will be shared at the end of the presentation. And with that, Devon, I will stop sharing my screen and let you go ahead and start.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Hopefully that's showing up good.
Yep, we're seeing it perfect.
Great. Well, it's good to be with all of you today. My name is Davon Cook with Pinion. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I do in just a moment. But I'm excited to be here today to talk about this topic of transitions of leadership in our ag businesses. And I don't think you can go to any farm conference of any type in your county, state, or nation without there being some topic on the agenda around either the words estate planning or succession planning. And I'm going to start today with just giving us a little bit of clarification of that. But the title of this workshop today is Passing the Baton. And that brings to mind these very skilled, smooth, well-trained relay runners that are passing a baton. But the reality of how it feels like to us sometimes in our farm businesses is that it can feel a little bit like changing the tire while driving, a little messier and more difficult. So the difference that I really want to have us talk about is what is an estate plan and what is a succession plan? Because I think understanding that distinction helps us make sure we're focusing on each discreetly because they really take some really different focus areas. So we like to say an estate plan is a transition of ownership, and it actually can take place beyond an estate plan. It can also be, a sales transaction during a lifetime or gifting during a lifetime. But the point is that it's a transfer of assets, whereas estate planning is the transition of leadership. And frankly, if you look down that list of attributes here, it's sometimes harder because it's things that evolve every day, and it's transitioning what you actually do, your skills and the activities and the decisions you make. It has to be really collaborative between generations. It often involves a larger set of people and requires something that we call psychological ownership. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in a bit. So to start off today, I want to say both of these are very important and they obviously overlap and are linked a lot. But make sure you're kind of giving both your attention in intentional ways. And another challenge we see sometime in farm transitions is the leadership transition driving the asset transition too much, or vice versa. Making the right tax decision and avoiding estate tax sometimes leads us to do some planning that may not have fully thought through what that transition of leadership and decision making is going to look like. So with that, why am I here talking about this today? Pinion is a nationwide accounting and consulting firm really focused in the whole food and ag chain and a lot in production ag. We're nearly 100 years old, and 2/3 of our business is in that food and ag value chain. So as a firm, we offer all of the resources you're seeing here. I'm not going to go into them today. My particular specialty is helping family-owned businesses through this transition of leadership and ownership. So sorry, I'm having a problem with my slides kind of moving themselves. I apologize. So I focus a lot on coaching and being the facilitator and quarterback of succession handoff processes within family members working together. Sometimes that's across generations. Sometimes it's the same generations of siblings or cousins that are trying to figure out how to make the business function well together. And then also I do facilitate and help a lot with estate planning. And within our company Pinion, we have lots of technical expertise on estate planning, which I think you've heard from some others previously. So I come to this saying, in a given year, I directly or indirectly through the peer groups we run, probably talk to 75 to 100 farm families a year around what's going on with them around succession planning. So, hope I can bring that experience to you today. And my goal here is to provide you some really concrete tools to help yourself get started if that's something you're struggling with. So, one of the first tools I want to introduce is this concept of the three circles of family business. And I imagine that a lot of you have seen this before, but acquaint yourself if you haven't. The idea is that in a family owned business, we're often wearing a lot of different caps, as you see laid out there. And when we start talking about that transition of leadership, first of all, one of the best things you can do in those conversations within your family and ownership group and is to clarify which circle we're in. So many of you listening today may have an ownership stake in your business. Some of you may be running it, being employees. You may be really experienced leadership of the business. You may be a brand new employee, but you're working in that management circle of the business. And then many of you are going to be family members. And you can imagine there's people in all three of those circles and some people that overlap in the middle where they're in two or three at the same time. And this is, unpacking this diagram probably is about 85 to 90% of the facilitation work I do. So that might be another separate webinar to get into the details. But in the context of today's transition of leadership, I just ask you and encourage you to use this as a tool to say, all right, are we planning right now as owners, or are we planning right now as employees and managers? Because there might be different groups of people at those two different tables that need to be included in those conversations. Or for some of you, they may be completely overlapping, but just really think through that specifically. The next framework I want to share, this is really to kind of just put into context some of the growing pains that people are often feeling and to normalize that's typical and it's just part of the journey. But we like to think of these four phases of a typical family business. Somebody in your family lineage, you or someone many generations ago, started out in survival stage, where you were, startup and just trying to be financially stable. Then many of our farms will transition to stable phase, where they may still be owned mostly by an individual or a married couple, but they're having some net worth growth, and they may be starting to have another generation participate in the business and maybe have a few, one or two key employees. Then the next stage, professional. I don't really love the term professional because I don't want it to imply that you weren't behaving professionally before then. But in this context, the word professional is to describe just the life stage of the business where things got more complicated and had to be more structured because ownership spread to a larger number of people and generations. The business is growing. You probably have an increasing number of non-family employees and potentially management employees. We see lots of farms nowadays, and particularly in Illinois and some of the most fertile farmland in the country. Your farms are getting of a size where folks have hired a CFO that may not be from the family. They've hired production leads and lots of important folks to their operation that may not be family. And suddenly, this is where you start feeling those growing pains. There's a lot of people stepping on each other's toes. Roles may not be clear. We're feeling the need that we got to establish some policies and formalize some things that may not always feel good. This is where I hear some pushback of, we don't want to get too corporate-y, or we don't want to be too bureaucratic. We're a family farm. But it's people trying to find that right balance of structure. And that really plays into the topic today of these transitions of leadership. And I think you'll see that a bit more in the coming discussion. That last stage, I'm not going to spend much time on today. Some families aspire to and some families don't. But the point is you could get to an institutional stage where you could have a mix of outside capital, be much more formally governed by a board of directors and so forth. So again, notice on this diagram that there are succession, there are change of leadership options all along that path. It just can help you think through which stage you're at to kind of help select what's the right way to go about it. So I mentioned earlier, succession is psychological ownership. And what I've got on the screen is a little bit of a guiding list and a little bit of a laundry list of all the topics that if you want to have a really successful transition of leadership, these are the topics you should be discussing and working through and coming up with very specific agreement to or very specific plans for. So if I think of someone leaving this webinar today, I'm going to show you a bunch of tools and you can pick the one that's most relevant to you. But this is potentially a page, we'll make these handouts available, that you may take to the next family meeting and sit down and say, okay, here's the list of topics that we really need to make sure we're on the same page about. And that psychological ownership means we got on the same page, we're all bought in, we're moving the same direction. So that's everything from, big picture vision, where are we headed? And then more specific goals of what do we want to accomplish in the shorter term of 1, 3, and 5 years. That sounds, that may sound a little obvious, but you would be surprised how many times in ag, people put their head down and work. They make some assumptions about what their business partners want or kind of assume we're on the same page. And this is where we see conflict rise up in family businesses where time passes and unintentionally, it's not by anybody's bad intentions, but unintentionally you wake up 10 or 15 or 20 years later and realize that we have partners in a business that may not be aligned anymore. That may, one wants to grow a lot and one really doesn't. One is very comfortable with debt, one is really not. Some kind of fundamental things around your vision, goals, and values that are important to visit. So if I think about generational transition and handoff of leadership, same thing. You're going to see some changes generationally as a new generation takes over. Of course, over time, the businesses may evolve in a different direction, and that's healthy. But at that handoff point, you got to be somewhat aligned around where we're headed, at least for the interim years. Then after those three, we get into a little more nuts and bolts topics like structure. Does our entity structure and our ownership structure set up for succession? Do we have buy-sell agreements in place that make it clear how transactions would happen? Do we have a plan for how a next gen would either earn ownership or buy into the business? Do people understand those plans if they do exist? Another area that honestly, this is probably the more day-to-day rub of all the folks that we work with is just the day-to-day clarity on roles. What contributions does each person make? Have we put people in their strengths? Are we providing the right training and development to build that next generation of leaders? We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Performance expectations, another hot topic that is really important. Are we clear on what we expect from people? And do we have a process to let them know how they're doing? So there's a lot of questions baked into a couple of short sentences there. That's everything from, do people understand performance expectations of, when I need to show up, how much vacation I allowed to have? Am I taking too much? Is my job role clear? And then it goes to, do we have a process where people are getting honest feedback in a constructive way? And that can be really challenging in when you're working with a bunch of family. Everybody knows it's probably not always comfortable to, maybe we aren't even well equipped to provide unbiased feedback to family members. And then even if we do have good feedback, it's sometimes hard to deliver it. And so thinking through how you put some structure around that process can be really important. Next category, results. That gets into just financially, do we have good systems in place where we understand how the business is doing? Because it's hard to set goals and make good decisions together and set the next generation up for success if you really don't have accurate information. Transitions, when is the leading gen, the current leaders of the business, transitioning in? And when can next generation leaders expect to take on different roles? That's the key right there in the word succession, right? When is succession going to happen? And I do want to stress again from one of the earlier slides, it's not a day of the calendar. It's not succession happens on December 31st, 2025. There may indeed be a title change that could happen at a certain date and time. And there can be some transactions of ownership that happen. But that process of passing on knowledge and leadership happens every day over a time period. Communication, I think that's something every single organization can always get better at, from Pinion all the way down to the smallest farm on the call today. And so thinking through specifically how we have communication built into our system can be important. And that is one that I think we also sometimes at farms undersell ourselves by thinking we don't want to get too many meetings or that's too corporate-y. But I will tell you, it's so important to the success of our businesses these days is to make sure that you've got communication systems set up across the business. And I would also go back to those three circles I showed earlier. Sometimes thinking intentionally about, what's the meeting that happens for the management circle? And maybe that's weekly or monthly to make management decisions. What's the ownership circle meeting cycle? Is that once a year, twice a year, three times a year that all the owners need to sit down and really think with their owners' hats on? And then what's the family? What are the times of the year where the family ones can probably be two categories. It's when are we having family time to build our, relationships as a family. But then also, when are we convening the broader family, including maybe kids that are not at the farm and spouses and cousins that still have some vested interest? Are we getting those people together once or twice a year to just kind of give them an update on the business? Because even if they aren't owners and even if they don't have a vote, they do still have influence and have, it impacts their lives. So think of communication in those three circles. And then finally, governance. Governance is a fancy word for how are decisions made? Who, when, and where? Who makes the decision, when, in what meeting? I often joke that, oftentimes our governance system is whoever happened to walk through the office the day that two people were sitting down talking about, whether to buy a new combine, right? So it sometimes can be pretty accidental or opportunistic of who happened to be around. And so that's something that gets pretty challenging in this handoff of leadership is sometimes it's that senior gen being intentional about slowing down and saying, oh, wait, I got the call from the salesman, but I shouldn't answer that right now. I shouldn't make this decision right now on my own, even though I'm perfectly skilled at it and I know what the right decision is. Maybe I need to slow down and bring some other folks into the room and into that discussion in the spirit of making transition and knowledge transfer happen. So I know I covered a lot. I touched at a pretty high level on a lot of topics on that list. But as I said, it's a pretty good outline of if you did a great job getting clarity and people on the same page answering this list of questions, you'd be pretty far down the road at planning for a successful transition of leadership. You'll see if these themes kind of come back in some of the additional tools I'm going to share you. Okay, so I gave you the best case. Go talk about that list. Now the question becomes, why are we here? Davon, if it's that easy, why do we have unlimited number of education sessions about this? Well, I think we all know what it feels like to be stuck. I grew up in a rural part of West Texas, Panhandle of Texas, and grew up about 4.5 miles off the highway on a very, very dirt road. And I'm just going to say I've spent a lot of time in Illinois, and your county roads are like interstate highways compared to your county dirt roads or interstate highways compared to the sort of cow track that I grew up on. So I spent a lot of time getting vehicles stuck in sand. Know exactly what that feels like. And we all seen, lots of entertaining pictures about tractors stuck in unfortunate situations. So if you signed up for this webinar today and you feel like, man, we know we need to do this, but we're just stuck. Here's the reasons, I hear from folks of why succession planning and transferring leadership is hard. Sometimes I just don't know how. I don't know how to get started. Or it's really awkward because we're going to have some awkward conversations about why this person's better for this role and not this role. Sometimes it's just we're too darn busy. I think today is a beautiful day during planting season in Illinois, so probably a lot of your members are out in the field busy running their business. Oftentimes there can be conflict, like we can foresee there's going to be some conflict in talking about succession, so we're just going to avoid it until we absolutely have to. So I'm going to try today to kind of give you the kick in the pants, and some tools to think about how to get beyond being stuck. One of the things I often hear when I start working with families is I will hear the senior gen say, "Man, I'm ready to hand off. I'm just waiting for them to take initiative." And then when I'm interviewing the rising generation of folks that will be learning and taking over the business, we raised really good, humble kids in rural America. And they say, well, I don't want to overstep. I don't want to seem entitled. I haven't really given permission to take that over, or I'm waiting for him and her to hand off. I mean, I hear these all the time. And it just brought to mind for me this picture of this like awkward 1970s dance going on. And it's we're sort of dancing around each other instead of digging in to that list of topics I mentioned earlier. Could be the chicken or the egg, it could be a tug of war. There's lots of ways to describe that. But what I like to help folks get unstuck is to start thinking through what competence, what skills, what demonstrated expertise do we need to build in that next generation of leaders so that we will have confidence letting go. So growing competence to have confidence. And so there's some work there for those of you planning for transitions to define what is it that I'm looking for competence in, and then what is the plan to make that happen. So here is a really practical tool that does a few different things. It helps clarify roles. I mentioned earlier, we see lots of people stepping on each other's toes. And it also helps push along that conversation I just mentioned of defining really specifically where someone should be growing into responsibility. So this tool I call the Responsible Consulted Informed Matrix. If you Google this, or whatever your search engine of choice or AI of choice is today, it's actually called RACI. It's RACI, Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. It's a framework that's been around in the business world for decades. And I just simplified it. I thought the accountable was a little bit redundant. But the idea here is to define a pretty specific list of tasks or decisions within your business down the left-hand side there. And then think of the key personnel, family and non-family, owners and non-owners, and define for each of those tasks who's responsible for getting it done. And that's who's the buck stops with, right? They may not actually do the work. They may supervise someone else to do the work, but they're responsible for making sure it got done. Who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed? And let me elaborate on those. Consulted could be because I have information and expertise that would be helpful, right? So I may previously have managed crop insurance, don't do it anymore, but I have a lot of expertise. So probably you should run it by me. But it also can be who should be consulted because of their status, just because they are the senior generation. They are the retiring CEO. Someone that just expects during this period of transition to still be kept in the loop, but is willing to give off some of the responsibility. And we want to go use their wisdom, right? Because they have it, and because to make a seamless transition happen, sometimes we just have to honor those roles and expectations of each other. The same for the informed category. Who needs to be informed because the work will be affected? My work will be affected by a decision you made. For example, office staff needs to be informed that we bought a new planter and make sure they put it on the liability insurance. I've actually heard of these stories happening where that didn't happen and we had an accident and realized, hey, we forgot to inform the person that manages the insurance, and it turns out to be a pretty costly mistake. But then also who needs to be informed because they have a role that expects to be informed for the same reasons. Maybe they have retired, but they're still an owner and a stakeholder in this business and expect to be kept in the loop. So if you go through this process, and you can make this happen a lot of different ways. You could have 4 different people fill it out individually and then compare your answers. And that might be very insightful of where the answers were obvious and where we had different perceptions of who was responsible, consulted, informed. Or you can do it as a group to start with. But the point is, it clarifies roles. And then the next part about leadership transition that is so important to use this tool is to talk about how does it need to change over time. So in this example, Sandy is responsible for a lot, right? Well, if we're at a period of time where Sandy is nearing retirement or just, slowing down and trying to hand off some leadership, then let's define, okay, within 2 years, we want John to be responsible for seed purchases. So what does John need to start shadowing this year to accomplish that? When does John start making those decisions as a trial? Do we start with a smaller piece of the responsibility? There would be lots of ways to go about that. But getting really granular at defining, here's the snapshot as of today, here's what it needs to look like in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. And then having specific conversations around how are we going to get that person trained up to get there. So this tool can be helpful. You can make this list as micro detailed as you want, or you can keep it big picture. Obviously, you're going to customize it to your operation, but it's a really practical tool that's super easy to slap in a spreadsheet and do on your own. Another one I like is a calendar of duties. And similar, this is a great way to basically write a shorthand job description for some of the senior leaders in our company. And so it provides a roadmap to build the job description of their replacement. It provides a roadmap of, hey, where do we need to write down or have someone learn how to do this with standard operating procedures or, hands-on training. And this can be as simple as, again, make yourself a matrix and literally have some of these key executives write down, what are the tasks that I do every day? What are the weekly things, monthly, quarterly? In farming, there's a lot of things we only do once a year. So you can also do this by the month, right? So February, March, I got to be working on crop insurance. Our insurance renewal is this month. Our banking renewal is this month. And you can start this literally just jotting down some quick bullet points and then use that in the same way to facilitate a conversation around, okay, which tasks need to get off of this person's list? Who are they going to? And how are we going to make that training and handoff of knowledge happen? Okay, this is a little bit different tool. And this is going to, remember I mentioned communication and governance on the earlier slide about the list of topics you should be working on. This concept is that for any good agreement to happen or for satisfaction long-term of a group of people working together, that you have to pay attention to all 3 points of this triangle. So typically we're really good in the business world at jumping to substance. So we focus on the decision at hand, which is, do we want to rent that that next 500 acres? Do we want to buy the new combine? Do we want to take on a new partner? Any number of decisions. We can get in the weeds really fast of running the spreadsheets, running the numbers, debating the pros and cons of the topic at hand. We often are guilty of not spending enough time on the process and potentially on the relationship. So the process, a lot of these tools I've already mentioned today are around how to put a process around planning together and communicating and deciding how decisions get made. So the governance piece, who makes the decision, when, with what information, and with who in the room. So this is an area that, you get busy running your business and it is really easy to neglect. And I will tell you, a lot of what we provide as facilitators and consultants is helping people put process around their planning and decision making. And then similarly, relationships. That's also probably worthy of all another webinar, relationships and family business. You probably all know wonderful success stories and, sad stories that we all don't like to hear. And just make sure you're investing in partnership groups, whether it's within one family or multiple branches. Don't get too busy to reinvest in making sure that you keep connection going and that you keep building trust with each other. Because when you get to a tough decision of substance or, when the process needs revamped or the process isn't working, that relationship glue is what you have to fall back on to make good decisions together and to stay within satisfaction. So as you're going through this transition of leadership conversations, um, make sure you're paying attention to all three of those. Okay. I mentioned as we were talking about the responsible consultant informed matrix, and several times I mentioned what's the training that needs to happen for those next generation of leaders. I like to think of this as kind of three big categories. There's sort of business acumen topics that any successful business person needs to conquer, right? Doesn't mean that you're an expert, deep expert in every single thing, but you got to have some basic understanding of kind of financial and accounting to be able to make good decisions. Again, doesn't mean you have to be the CFO or the accountant, but it means have we invested in enough training for people to understand what financial statements are telling us and to understand what financial ratios are indicating for our business? You need some business acumen around strategy, HR, managing people, etc. Then you need kind of technical expertise in whatever your relevant field is. If you're the expert in agronomy or genetics or nutrition, if you're the precision ag expert within the business, whatever someone's more narrow role is going to be, there's often some technical expertise. And then that third category, which is a lot more amorphous, is wow, to succeed in any business, and certainly with the complexities of family businesses, interpersonal leadership skills are really important. And those are learned over our lifetimes, right? I mean, none of us are perfect at them. We can always keep growing. But are you investing in the next generation? So then the question to me always comes, well, that's great, Davon, let's invest, but how are we going to go about that? And I've listed just a few sources over here on the right. Obviously, this is a generic slide. I'm sure Illinois Soybean Growers has education programs like the one you're at today, as well as many others that could be listed there as well. Just a few to think about. Peer groups are a wonderful place for all ages to learn from other businesses and be held accountable. My team at Pinion runs a portfolio of a bunch of peer groups within production ag, as well as there's other folks in the industry that provide those as well. TPEP is the executive program for ag producers that's held every January in Texas, kind of a little mini MBA course for farmers. I have had a lot of success with helping folks access really affordable, really cheap online courses from things like LinkedIn Learning or mini MBA programs you can do online, where you can get that financial acumen and strategy, some of the kind of core business type topics. You can get a pretty, condensed introductory exposure to at a really affordable price point. I use a lot of those for financial acumen, just kind of teaching next gens how to read financial statements and so forth. Obviously, Extension across our country has fantastic education going on. And then on that interpersonal leadership skills side, we cover a lot of things like that in our peer groups programs, but there's all sorts of other education programs that are focused on that, like a Dale Carnegie or Franklin Covey or all sorts of providers out there. So my point with this slide is, have you stopped and even defined what the training we're looking for is? And then have you really made a specific plan? I encourage folks to say, let's make a 2 or 3 year plan for a next gen. Here's the, 2 growth areas we want you to focus on in 2025. And here's the 2 workshops we're going to invest in this year to send you to. Keep it practical. I mean, don't pretend that you're going to devote gobs of time to this and keep your day job. Let's be realistic, but if we have something on paper for the next 3 years, we're much more likely to make it happen if we've mapped that out and been intentional about it. I have a little bit deeper competence skills matrix here that I'm going to let you mostly look at when you see these slides afterwards. This is from a research report from our professional organization called the Family Firm Institute that folks in my profession are members of. And it just made an attempt to kind of define what are the business acumen categories that a family business leader needs to have. And the next slide is what are the leadership categories, and gives you some ideas of, how to assess that in your next gens and where to go get help. And I have some clients that maybe start with an example like this and customize it to themselves and use this as a tool to help talk. If you have multiple family members and maybe you're going to have to make some decisions around who's the next CEO or who goes into what leadership chair, it can be helpful to have some guidance around here's what we're looking for, define what people are going to be assessed on. It's not any different than taking a test. I know what I'm going to be assessed on. And then, through time, your next gen has the opportunity to demonstrate that they've acquired these skills. So we call that, have the process before the need. So again, we're setting up a process that defines what the goal is before it has come down to deciding between kid A and kid B. That can get, as you can imagine, pretty emotional and pretty difficult fast. And so going back to my triangle, where can you put some process around how those decisions are going to be made? One more process piece related. If you are at a point where you're not, you maybe don't have your next gen back in the business yet, but you're in conversation with them. Maybe you have kids of junior high and high school or college age that are considering a future in the business. Maybe they're already professionals considering coming back. One of the guidelines that we highly suggest you sit down and think through proactively is how will family employment work here? And I will say before I go into this, people do come to us after family is already engaged in the business and say, man, we didn't do this well enough before we started. We need to clarify some things now. And that's typical too. So if that's your situation, don't feel like the bus has already left you. There still can be a lot of value in having this conversation. I call these family employment guidelines instead of policy. You'll hear the word policy a lot, simply because I'm a realist. And I think policy implies we wrote it one time and it is set in stone and there's no further discussion. I use the word guideline, and that doesn't mean somebody can willy-nilly break the rules and we're just going to ignore it. But it means we recognize that the family and the business is going to evolve over time, and we need to keep revisiting this, and we need to be prepared that we may make adjustments in the future. The key when you do that is, were all the right decision makers at the table, and did they all really agree if we made a change or made an adjustment? What you don't want it to be is, let's say that we had a guideline that said you had to work 2 years somewhere else before you work for our business, and then a parent went off and just hired the person without following that rule. That is not the changes we want. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just simply saying these are living documents. These are living families and living businesses, and things will evolve. But you'll see on here an outline of the topics you need to consider in family employment guidelines. I'm not going to go into those right now. If somebody wants me to elaborate, I will do that during the Q&A here in a minute. Again, that's probably a whole nother workshop of itself, but this provides you a good outline to start that conversation with your family if that's where you're at. Okay, just to wrap up here, a few of our parting words are often this. Planning is a process, not an event. Just like I said, succession doesn't happen on December 31st. It happens over a number of weeks, months, and years usually. Lots of times if your family is sitting down to have this conversation the first time, you may be starting up here at reflection stage. You all have some assumptions, you're talking about them, you're trying to confirm them and get from I knowledge to we knowledge. That's usually the opening conversation. If you put that list up, psychological ownership list I showed earlier, you're starting from getting from assumptions to understanding what each other thinks. Then you go into some planning, you take some action, and you need to keep going through that process because it will evolve and you won't get it all right the first time. You'll try some things that won't go well, I promise you. But if you've built in that process of communication, you can keep at it. Along with that, progress over perfection. Don't allow the fear of doing something wrong to let you stay stuck in the mud, right? Make some progress, get the conversation started. And, that's how you do it. You just keep chipping away at it. And over time, succession will happen one way or another. It's just a matter of how seamless it is and how well your business is rewarded for doing it well. I think that, Corey, is the end of what I had planned to cover. I'm happy to elaborate on any of those tools, topics, or things I didn't cover. I'll do my best to answer the questions that are out there.
Excellent. And I will just do some logistics here real fast. So, first off, thank you for that great presentation. I do want to remind folks that today's presentation was brought to you by Illinois soybean growers. So, if you're not a grower member, I encourage you to use the QR code to become a member at this time. Additionally, for those who are in attendance to get CEUs, continuing education credits, you can use the QR code on the screen now to register for those credits. If there's any problems, you can email Ashley Berry at illsoy.org, and she can help get that figured out on the back end. So with that, I just want to transition to our Q&A. And so I'll kick off the Q&A by reminding people that there's an opportunity to put questions in the chat. And so please feel free, or please do that at this time. With that, I also want to introduce our other panelist, Colin Cisco, who comes to us from the Illinois soybean grower team. He covers farm policy and estate tax and these kind of broad topics. And so, Colin, if you want to just real quickly let us know what Illinois soybean growers is doing on this topic, and then we'll move into the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So I guess obviously if you are on this call today, this webinar, you understand that Illinois estate tax law is it's something that needs to be fixed and changed, especially for our farmers. I think the average farm here in Illinois hits our $4 million threshold relatively quickly. And we've heard that from our farmers. So something we've been working on over the past few years is some relief when it comes to estate tax. One of the biggest hurdles that we've heard over the past few years in the legislature has been that, we have tightening budgets, state budgets. And so working towards an estate tax that does not take away from the state budget, and it doesn't take away any state money, is kind of key to getting an estate tax reform done. So we've done that. Just kind of a little background, the Attorney General's office is the state agency that oversees the estate tax. Is the only tax that the Department of Revenue doesn't oversee. So at the Illinois soybean growers, we've been working with the AG's office on utilizing data over the past several years and rewriting the estate tax code to one, make it much simpler. Right now, there's about 20 different tax brackets you could fall under, and it's a marginal tax rate. So your estate could fall within like seven or eight different tax brackets. So it's really hard to kind of prepare for your estate planning when you have all these tax brackets that you have to try to figure out. So one, the legislation that we're working on would take it down to four different tax brackets, and it wouldn't be marginal, which means that whatever tax bracket that your estate would fall into, that's the amount that you would pay, making it much simpler for you to plan your estate and succession planning because you know what your tax rate is going to be. As well as the big key here, like I said, is to make it revenue neutral. So what that means is that the smaller states would see a tax decrease, while the much larger estates would see a tax increase. And this is estates $25 million and above that would see a tax increase. So I think when we talk to our farmers, that is not a large portion of the farmers that we are talking about. And then those $4 million, $5 million, $6 million estates would see a tax decrease. And we've had really positive conversations with legislators here in Springfield, and hoping that the conversations, remain positive, and hopefully something gets done by the end of session here in May.
That's great, Colin. And it's good to hear how much Illinois soybean growers is working on this topic. We know estate planning and succession planning and estate tax are major issues for our farmers. And Davon, that kind of actually leads me into my first question for you. In your presentation, you right up front, Colin's talking about estate planning, estate tax, and you made this distinction between ownership and leadership. And so I would love for you to just kind of quickly kind of restate what's the difference between ownership and leadership, and why is it important for people thinking about this to have that distinction? Because I think in a lot of people's minds, The person who owns it is the person who leads it. These are kind of the same thing. So I just want to let's start off with that.
Great question, and I'll throw that slide back up so people can absorb more of it if they missed it the first time. In many of our family farms, those two folks are the same. And especially thinking of that life cycle slide I showed, maybe when you're in that stable category, they were 100% the same. So certainly in survival stage, they were 100% the same folks. But as your farm gets bigger, you may have folks that are not in ownership have significant leadership roles. As our generations spread out, many of our family farms will have off-farm family members that maybe own some land. They aren't involved in the daily operations, but they inherited land that they still control. So they're an owner, but not necessarily a leader in the operating entity itself. Very typical. As I mentioned, a lot of folks are intentionally recruiting talent that maybe is not within their family. You all know, people see the statistics of age of farmers and, the fact that not every farm is going to have a family member as a successor. So for all of those reasons, those two circles can diverge a little bit as far as who is an owner versus a leader. And that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, a healthy business should be aspiring to attract talent. That is what that business needs, whether it's entirely family talent or otherwise. And just that reality I mentioned of off-farm heirs, we do a lot of planning with families around. Let me skip to the three circles thing here. We do a lot of planning around, hey, if that ownership group is a different subset of people than management, how do we educate them around? So I'm thinking of kids that own land that don't live here and don't work on the farm. How do we educate them on how they have an appropriate amount of involvement? They need to know what's going on. We want them to be happy landowners. We want them to have a positive relationship from a rental perspective with whether their family member or operating entity is renting that land. But we don't want them meddling in day-to-day operations and trying to micromanage something where they're not a management team member. And so, those are some real world, very common examples of where those two things can really diverge. Did that answer your question, Corey?
Yeah, 100%. That was a great response. I appreciate you expanding on that. I know you covered it in the webinar, but I think it's an important issue to dive into a little bit deeper. So on that thought of diving a little bit deeper, you spent a big portion of the webinar on a slide that kind of covered like differences where we could, yes, you read where I was going with this. One of the things that really stuck with me when you were speaking was this conversation about differences in vision. And so you used the example of debt and tolerance for debt.
Mm-hmm.
And so one conversation I've heard a lot, dad lived through, one of many farm crises in the past. And so he really doesn't trust debt. He wants no debt. But son sees debt as a financial tool to expand the operation, to make sure that there's room in the operation for himself and his family, as well as his dad. Can you give some practical examples or stories of how to talk through, maybe not with that specific example, but to help people kind of think about how do you talk through these very strong differences of opinion? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about first, maybe a conversation starter around it. And then I want to address, go back to my technical colleagues that I mentioned have done webinars before on estate planning and such. I want to point to something they might say to you. So how do you start the conversation? Really simple thing could be, hey, get all the relevant folks in the room, hand everybody a note card and say, please write a description of what this business looks like in 10 years. And you can describe it in terms of dollars, acre, debt, reputation of the community, how many acres, how many cows, how many family members, any way you want to describe it, but write, a 2 or 3 sentence description of what this business looks like in 10 years. And that just opens the door when you start, have everybody share that out, and you'll see pretty quickly, are we generally aligned, or do we have some pretty stark changes here? And then the next step in that same exercise could be have everybody write down, what do I want my role to be in whatever's the right time frame for you. Is it 10 years or 5 years? It kind of depends on where you're at. But in a defined time frame, what do I want my role to be? Same thing by putting in a note card and sort of facilitating in that. It just opens the floor a little bit safer for people to throw out what they've been thinking that they may not be telling you themselves. My colleague Lance Woodbury tells a story of early in his career. He did this with a family, and someone took that opportunity to say, "Oh yeah, I'm planning to run for public office, and I'm not going to be here next year." That was like the moment they announced it to the family. So you want to provide that opening for people to be honest about what their goals are as well. Now, how do you resolve it if they're very different? That's a much more nuanced answer, right? I mean, if you're fundamentally different in a way that's causing a lot of conflict or really hamstringing the business, then you got to do the hard work to resolve that, whether it's coming to consensus agreement or whether it's realizing you don't need to be partners together anymore. That's kind of the extreme end of the situation. But what I will say, thinking about that generational scenario you gave, Corey, that is where the folks helping with the estate planning or the entity transactions can help think through if dad is debt averse and maybe just really worried about financial security in retirement, right? So I don't want to take on a lot of debt and not have the money I need for the next 20, 30 years of my retirement. There's ways that your technical advisors, your accountants and attorneys that are helping with those transactions can think through to provide them some certainty. And I'm not going to get into those tools today because that is definitely another webinar, but that's the type of conversation you want to be having with those technical advisors. It's not, I mentioned earlier, we get focused on estate tax, and no offense, Colin, but you just talked about estate tax, and I understand that's a very relevant topic, but don't let the estate tax dog or tail wag the dog, however that saying goes, don't let that be the only focus area, but also be bringing up, hey, it's also really important that dad doesn't get saddled with this debt if something goes wrong. Or it's also really important that we don't put siblings that hate each other and are unlikely to cooperate together into a irrevocable trust. Great tax planning tool, but don't set it up for failure to begin with because you didn't pay attention to the human side of those relationships. So if, in your scenario, there can be some technical things to help with some of those realities, like different debt structures. Make sure you're talking to your financial advisors about the human side of those considerations as well.
Davon, that was a great response, and I really appreciate that. And one thing that kind of came to mind when you were answering there was this thought of siblings and inheritance. And obviously, this is a growing concern. And so, one topic I get a lot when I talk to farmers broadly is this concept of there's one sibling who works the farm, but the parents want to share the inheritance evenly. And so, how do you have that? Do you have any thoughts on having that conversation of, okay, this guy or this girl, whoever, this sibling has invested heavily in the farm operation with their own time. And so they deserve maybe more ownership of the inheritance of that. And maybe you disagree with that statement. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you have quickly just some thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question of does fair mean equal? And my answer to you, Corey, is it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what's right for your family. So I have advised clients who came to completely different answers there, right? To some, fair absolutely meant equal, and to some, the scenario you laid out made a lot of sense. And I can certainly help you talk through the pros and cons of both of those, the situations I've seen, what you should consider. At the end of the day, it's what's right for your family. Now, I will say from a practical standpoint of what do we see happen a lot, oftentimes what I will see families land on is separating land and real estate assets from operating assets, and think about those in different buckets to start with, and probably do their estate planning and their entity planning to protect the operating entity, and that could include the equipment, the grain bins, the cash maybe that's sitting in there. Provide that for those that are running the business, and then provide equal shares of land to all their children, maybe unequal shares of land. They still may recognize those running the business with more land, But decoupling those two groups of assets is very common and very practical. That works well. And then you're putting those non-farm heirs, owning land. It's an asset that's pretty arm's length, right? We can have a rental agreement with the rest of the family or the operating entity. So we see that a lot.
That was great. And I love the answer of it. What matters is what works for your family. That's just such a great way to answer that question.
But I do appreciate you bringing it up because as an advisor, my responsibility is not to tell you which one of those is right, but it is to make sure you're asking that fundamental question and wrestling with it and considering it, because you're absolutely right that that's fundamentally an important one.
Thank you. So one thing you mentioned a few times in our conversation afterwards and during the webinar is this concept of a family meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a little amused by that because I was thinking in my head of the farmers I know, how many of them actually have a family meeting or a farm meeting? And I'm sure some of them do, but I'm not sure all of them do. So could you expand on what's a family farm meeting? What's it look like? And then if you wanted to start one on your family farm, how do you have that conversation with, some fear maybe around looking silly or something when you ask that question?
Yeah. I'm going to pull up my 3 circles. I told you this is 85% of what I do. I think a lot more farms have family meetings than you think. They just may not call them family meetings, right? It may be when everybody's home for Thanksgiving, mom and dad sit everybody down and say, hey, we've been working on estate planning. Here's what we're thinking. Or they give an update on the farm. Here's what's going on. So it happens informally, and that gets to sometimes it happens accidentally. So maybe not everybody was invited or included or prepared. So I would encourage you to be more intentional about it. If you've never had one and you're like, what the heck is that? I would think about probably I start in this ownership or future ownership circle. So probably this overlap of ownership and family. So I might be gathering my kids that some farm, some off farm, maybe they haven't inherited anything yet. And number one, tell them ahead of time you're going to have the meeting. Don't spring it on them after lunch on Thanksgiving when everybody was headed to the movies, which literally happened in my family once. So give them notice. We're going to do this and a little bit of what to expect. And if it's your first one, be honest about, I don't quite know how to do this. I'm a little nervous. We haven't done this well in the past, but I know it's important that, to prevent problems that we've all seen go wrong with neighbors, that we do a good job of communicating. Have a pretty simple agenda that could start with state of the farm today. Just how's it going? Because you'll be surprised, those that don't work there every day, they grew up there, they're emotionally invested, like they're curious, they want to know, they want to support you. So update on the business. Here's some challenges we're facing. Depending on where you are in your planning process, tell them where you are. Hey, mom and I know we need to do estate planning. We're planning to hire some people to help us next year. That's on our to-do list. You'll be amazed at how your kids will all go, oh my gosh, thank goodness. Like it's about time. So don't put progress over perfection was my tagline. It doesn't have to be perfect, but open the lines of communication if you're starting from nothing.
I love the like tagline, progress over perfection. It kind of goes well with, don't let perfection be the challenge of getting the job done, or whatever the saying is. I'm failing there. So just kind of this is going to throw you as a kind of a curveball question, but I like to ask it during these webinars. One topic that's interfacing everywhere is artificial intelligence. Is there an AI piece to this conversation? Maybe not to the conversation, but to having a successful farm plan? Just real quickly, any thoughts there?
I mean, short answer is I'm sure there should be or is in the making. I don't have it to hand it to you today, but yes, I mean, for sure there's tools out there, AI or otherwise, that are kind of DIY kits to have these conversations, just like tools I shared with you today. I'm probably old school and skeptical when I say there's still so much of these conversations that are human oriented that I don't think we're going to completely automate it anytime soon. I think I have job security for my career. I don't know about someone 20, but there's still a lot of of human emotion involved in this, but certainly there's gonna, there are great toolkits that will continue to evolve.
Awesome. I wasn't sure what to expect with that question. I just wanted to ask it.
Yeah.
Um, so just kind of a wrap up question here. Um, just focusing on how to be successful in this. What are some characteristics, maybe just two or three characteristics of a family operation that will be successful in their in their succession planning? Are there characteristics we can look for? And then kind of at a counter to that, what are pitfalls? What is the most common mistake? Maybe it's a really common small mistake. And then what's like a worst case real life example? I know I gave you a lot in that one
Way to
question.
end positive there, Corey. Um, Characteristics, proactive is ideal. Not everybody's going to reach that, but that's the ideal. Those are the clients that are so fun to work with, that are ahead of the game having these conversations. Willing to have tough conversations. I mean, just willing to get past the discomfort and awkwardness and stuck, picture that I drew earlier, are really the keys to success. And willing to invest in process and communication. Like, those do take time. They take money because they take time out of your day and out of your productivity. And so that's also probably where I would go to pitfalls. It's the people that, think we're going to have a couple good meetings and we're done. The people that don't value meetings, period. I mean, think it's a total waste of time to get people in the room to communicate. The people that underinvest there are the ones that will have the hardest time. And I get it. We're busy, and you don't see this immediate return on investment. But those are the distinctions. What was your other question? A worst case example? I doubt I need
Yeah,
to.
we'll end on a positive note. Worst case example.
I doubt I need to outline that. I think everybody listening to this webinar has a worst case example in mind of someone they know in their county where, the family split up with great conflict and are not speaking to each other. I mean, those are the worst case examples. I don't like to focus on those because everybody's already so afraid of that. And I like to say it doesn't have to be that. I also say it doesn't mean that every family business needs to stay together in the same ownership group for 5 generations. For some people, that's going to be very successful. And for some, their visions are going to be different. Their goals are going to be different. They're not going to get along. And they would be better off, partitioning and being successful separately. So we all know the worst case. I like to open people's eyes to all the possible good cases. It's not just one road of, you do it this way. And if you're in your 10th generation, you have, you are the biggest success story. It's, you do it what's right for your family and the evolution of your business.
All right. Thanks, Devon and Colin, for joining us. I love wrapping that with the whole concept of, we can do this as a farm operation if we're proactive, we're willing to invest in the process, and we're willing to have hard conversations. You can have a successful outcome with your succession planning. And so with that, I'm going to conclude our April Illinois soybean growers webinar. Thank you so much for attending, and hope to see you next month.